Welcome to The Summit, a podcast focused on bringing you the knowledge and insights for industry leaders. I'm your host, Kyle Hamer, and I'm on a mission to help you exceed your potential.
Morning, welcome to The Summit. This is Kyle Hamer. Today, my guest on The Summit is Justin Gray. Justin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
For those of you who don't know Justin, Justin is a strong voice for entrepreneurship. He loves marketing, building intentional organizational culture. He's been a recognized speaker around the country and is the founder of LeadMD, which is the largest performance marketing consultancy, which is a mouthful, in the US or in the world. Is it which is it? Is it the US or is it the world, Justin?
I don't know anyone in the world that's done more of what we do than us.
That's awesome. Today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about things that Justin knows a lot about: marketing, entrepreneurship, and then really kind of the impact of what we're seeing as the economy starts to reopen and things as it relates to COVID-19. But just kind of talk a little bit about your passion for entrepreneurship and marketing, and maybe how you got started with LeadMD. What did you see happen, and what motivated you to get rolling?
Sure. Yeah, it's actually was on Lean Data's Ops Stars yesterday, and they asked us what our origin story was, and I always say that my origin story is 100% by accident and really relationship based, which I think are themes that you'll see reoccur throughout my career. But unlike a lot of marketers, I actually went to school for marketing. Can't say that any of that really helps me in my day-to-day these days, but graduated with a marketing degree, got a bunch of marketing jobs that I hated. I actually graduated in 2001 and got to live through the whole September 11th fallout and everything that brought. So there just weren't a lot of jobs. And of course, I took pretty much the first one that came along and really thought that I was in for a life of misery. Kind of worked my way up in different marketing roles, and then got what I would consider the opportunity that I try to give to other people within the LeadMD structure and other business structures these days, which was just to be a part of a startup organization. I think, like in 2006, that was much less popular than it is today. I didn't really know what it was or what it would entail, but it kind of opened, certainly cut through the bureaucratic red tape that I had been so just adamantly struggling against within my previous roles, and opened the door to, hey, if it needs to get done and you can do it, go do it, right? And so, came on as I think I came on originally as a director of marketing for a payment technology company, quickly worked my way up to VP, took over sales as well. And that was really where my eyes got open to, like, wow, this is what I want to do. Not only digital marketing, but within an environment where, there just weren't a lot of those barriers and limitations and so on. And I love the startup feel of an organization. I love the first $10 million of an organization. And that's really what I got to experience there. So put in my time, built up a chunk of sweat equity within that company, had an exit in 2000 and early 2009. And that's really where I thought, hey, I'm going to go figure out what I want to do next. At that organization, we had actually purchased Marketo in early 2007. So I was literally like their 20th customer, maybe even earlier than that. I don't know the exact number, but that was a really, aha moment as well, simply because we, in that organization, we went to market through our partners. So we were a payment technology that was integrated into, I think, 50 plus software solutions. And really, we marketed to the end users of the software. So every time we went to market with an email message or via a trade show or whatever the channel was, we were co-branded with that software provider. And so we were doing all of that through an ESP, pull a list, segment it, blast it, and when we stumbled upon Marketo, I was like, wow, holy, I don't know if I could swear on this show, but like really interesting moment, right? So I had brought Marketo on, and I brought Salesforce.com in, and we'd started building, what would now be known as a tech stack. Well, when I left that organization, again, I thought I was going to take a year off and have some fun, travel the world, so on and so forth. I ended up taking 3 days off because I got a phone call that said, hey, can you do what you did at BillingTree for us? And then I got another call and another call. And before you knew it, I had 3 retainer clients where I was doing essentially fractional CMO, but then also, again, what we would call marketing operations work or revenue operations work today. So building those processes, those systems, educating their teams, and really just driving their revenue engine forward. So that was the start of LeadMD quite accidentally. And before you knew it, we had employees and office space and the whole nine. And then, kind of the rest is history in terms of that progression path and so on. But there's obviously been a lot of shifts and interesting happenings. COVID-19 is obviously one of those. But, we also started this business in the wake of, the Great Recession in 2008 and so on. So I think digital marketing and what marketing has transformed into has largely been a response to really detrimental economic happenings and pulling a lot of what used to be vendor management in-house and enabling a marketing team to actually execute on their own campaigns and pull their own analytics and so on. So, LeadMD is a response to that entire trend.
Which is, you're in a great spot again, because on the heels of COVID, we're seeing yet another wave of budget reallocation or modernization, if you will, as companies move from, going to trade shows in person. Well, now we've got to do it virtually, which creates an entirely different set of outreach and segmentation and ways in which to touch your customers. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing. I mean, I know I've spoken with Josh, who's on your team, and we've talked a little bit about how enterprises are shifting. But what are you seeing happening, at a macro level to the economy as companies try and sort out? Well, I used to send postcards, but now nobody's at the office. How do I get my wares in front of people that are sitting at home at their desks?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the biggest macro trend for me is the focus and proximity to the customer. So regardless of the size of the business, right? Like, so when COVID-19 happened, obviously everyone wanted to figure out, what am I going to lose from a revenue stream standpoint, right? And for some organizations, figuring that out was much easier than others. And the ease factor there is proximity to the customer, understanding how an event like this was going to impact their clients, how it was going to impact what their clients' goals were pre-COVID, and ultimately ensuring that they were there to enable whatever that pivot looks like from their client standpoint during and ultimately post-COVID. That, so let's just take a step back and let's think about how companies measure the health of their relationship with their existing customers, which of course translates to prospecting and customer acquisition and so on. But most organizations, even during the sales cycle, are implementing these false metrics, right? False metrics that center on things that matter to them, the provider, usage, X number of whatever that software facilitates or whatever that service facilitates. You could even apply that to our business. Like, is it my goal to help my clients get campaigns out the door? Or is it my goal for those campaigns to generate results, right? Like, we can focus on two very related metrics there, but one means something to the customer, one means something to me, or from a usage and a health perspective, right? And so, like, any software organization that was measuring these superficial metrics that basically just allowed them to understand, is the company using my solution? And they took that as a proxy for, are they succeeding with it? I think really got turned upside down here, because they had no understanding of the mission criticality of the software or the service that they were providing. They just had an understanding of, was it being used? And in a lot of cases, the software wasn't even being used. So certainly if they're not using it, they're not going to be successful. But even if they are they generating the result that they originally bought that software to accomplish? And I don't think a lot of organizations had a straight line into what the goals of their customers were. And therefore, they were not able to predict that churn. They were not able to quickly get the customer on the phone or get a meeting with them and talk about how that goal might be shifting now, inside of this COVID world. So I think that's the biggest takeaway from COVID, which is you have to explicitly understand why your customers purchased, again, whatever it is, your solution, your service, whatever. And then you have to measure the accomplishment towards that goal, in all these QBRs and all these, check-ins and sprint plans, weekly meetings, whatever they are. We have to be revisiting that goal and talking very painfully and transparently about, are we helping you achieve that goal? And if you're not having that conversation, I think those are the businesses that really struggled throughout this process and are continuing to struggle. And it's a really difficult thing to take a look at a user base of 10,000 users at this point and say, well, I'm going to go out there and now capture what I should have captured months, years ago within a sales cycle. So it's a really big lift. And so those organizations are now spending time trying to just go figure out why their customers using their solution. Are they helping them achieve that goal when they could be spending time pivoting their go-to-market, rolling out new solutions to better serve that customer and their new goal and so on. So, we only have so much time available to us. And the really successful organizations already had those really foundational understandings of their client and were able to now focus on the change, the pivot, rather than having to go back and figure out just what is the state of our customer relationship.
I think that the interesting thing about that is as I've talked to multiple folks on the state of the economy and state of business post-COVID, the interesting thing is it really all comes back to the basics to me, which is
Correct.
Know your customer, understand why they buy, make sure that you're still doing that. And if you have the opportunity to automate it or apply technology, do that. But don't go out and buy a technology and then try and figure out how to get your process to align to the technology. It's really revisiting the basics and what can be digitized and what cannot.
Yeah, I think, frankly, just a quick note on that. Like, I knew we had a problem, and I think anyone that had their eyes open knew we had a problem when I was going to all of these, events, roundtables. There's a bunch of analyst groups that run roundtables and just essentially capture what the market is doing, right? And I before travel was completely locked down, would go to a lot of these, and the section that would absolutely monopolize every one of those sessions is what is my tech stack? What technology am I using, right? Like, no one wanted to talk about their unique go-to-market. No one wanted to talk about how they were designing an awesome process to enable that, or how they were enabling their team. Everyone wanted to talk about, here's what I use, right? I've got Eloqua, I've got Marketo, I've got Salesforce. And that literally, if someone's giving an hour presentation on their business and how they market that business, 45 minutes, 50 minutes of it would be, what is my tech stack? And the audience would be super engaged, just asking questions. Oh, do you love outreach? We looked at SalesLoft. Like, it's quite evident that we're approaching things through what is the easiest channel to move to in a perception basis, move something forward. Like, if I want to transform, I'm going to go buy a technology. So completely backwards. And again, I think that's one of the fallouts of COVID, to your point. Like, we just need to focus on the fundamentals and how well we're achieving those fundamentals. And then we can talk about what enabled us to scale that out or to automate, just incredibly manual portions of that process. But we have to focus on how we're uniquely serving that customer and the results that we're generating.
And you and I couldn't be more in agreement when it comes to, we have, and I said this yesterday, I was talking with somebody, which is, technology is a terrible master, but it's a great servant. And if you have the right processes, procedures, philosophy, go-to-market strategy in place, sometimes technology doesn't really matter. What matters is, how much customization do you need to do to that technology to fit your specific use case? And too often people are like, hey, I'm going to go buy a server and I'm going to set it up to do whatever. Well, it's a blank slate, right? Unless you know exactly what you're going to do, it causes all kinds of challenges for the organization from an adoption standpoint, from a measurement standpoint, to truly understanding where you started, which is, how is what you're measuring getting back to revenue? How is it really impacting?
Agreed.
We say 2007. So when you said you were in your startup before, Salesforce was just becoming a development platform, or they were in the early phases of their development.
AppExchange was just happening. Yep.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about that from a progression standpoint. People often go out and they'll buy a point solution. So I'm going to get Salesforce and then I'll just follow it out of the box, which, you've worked with Salesforce, it's 85% of the way there, not all the way there.
Sure.
When you look at the opportunity that was created in the market, we went from sales, CRM, Act, Goldmine, Salesforce. Salesforce all of a sudden had this AppExchange and this platform. Now we actually need to start thinking through our process and our operation. It creates sales operations as a function. Marketo, Eloqua, they really start to expand, act on these. What was the Silverlight? There was another Microsoft. There was a Microsoft.
Yeah, I got.
It got axed, but it was like
I think
silverfish or
IBM.
something.
I think IBM bought them. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. But I mean, the V trends, like the market was like when we evaluated, which we were like at the 11th hour with Eloqua, by the way, when I ended up buying Marketo. But like all of the players in that space are no longer around. The only two that are around in some form. Well, I mean, Acton is part out now. Eloqua is under the Oracle banner, and now Marketo's under Adobe. So to your point on point solutions, like that acquisition strategy, I think is one that you're going to see continuing here, because we're kind of through the evolution of this best of breed software provider, and now we see behemoths like Adobe and Salesforce kind of going out and trying to piece together that branded approach.
Well, and it's history repeating itself, but what it's done is it's forced different disciplines inside of organizations. One where LeadMD found a nice spot with your experience in running sales teams, understanding that go-to-market strategy, how it impacts marketing and the different things you need to transition into. For many years, or we're just seeing marketing operations start to get the same level of attention, I would say, as what we saw in like 2007 to 2009 for sales operations and what you need for back office support there. But we're very rapidly approaching this new way of thinking, which is revenue operations. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's sales, it doesn't matter if it's marketing, it's all about getting back to the dollar. For organizations that are making these transitions and going through it, if I'm not digitized today, how do I go from not digitized today to thinking about things from revenue and what sort of operational components I need to support that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the trend behind, well, I'm undecided on the trend behind RevOps, I should say, which is a rare standpoint for me, because I think that there's many ways that you can execute revenue operations. The successful way, to your point, is I have to start with those foundational elements. What do I know about my buyer, right? Like who are those accounts that fit my solution really well? How do I know that those organizations purchase solutions? Who are the players inside, buyer personas, so on and so forth? Translated that into messaging, into content, into channels, into assets for that, in that planning phase, and then the translation into operations. I think that's a recipe for success. And the more that you can remove silos in that process, right? I can go hire McKinsey or Deloitte to put together a really great go-to-market strategy for my business. But the minute that they deliver something that is in a 400 slide PowerPoint, and I try to pivot that over to someone to translate it in the process, that's a natural disconnect point, right? Because it wasn't created with the operational lens of how it was actually going to get translated into process and end up within a system or within the hands of an individual. So you have to have that kind of, I call it operational dexterity, as you're developing go-to-market strategies, as you're developing target account research, as you're developing your content and messaging plan. You have to understand where that's ultimately going to end up. And I think that aspect of revenue operations is incredibly critical and can generate huge results from an organization, just in knowing how we're going to operationalize this eventually. Unfortunately, that's not how we think about tackling these projects or even consuming consulting. We think about going to work with one provider, then we hand that work off to the next or an in-house group, and it completely gets lost, right? All too often, and this is the bad element to revenue operations for me, we've created this silo of people that can run these new technologies, right? Like a lot of people have made their careers on, I know how to run Marketo, I know how to run Salesforce, I know how to run Eloqua, but they're not marketers at heart. They don't understand the fundamental concepts of engaging a buyer. And so
Right.
you get this just math, like almost this, okay, you guys deal with go-to-market strategy, you guys deal with buyer engagement. We're gonna build it and facilitate it through these solutions. And I think something's getting lost in that translation layer, because you're seeing folks talk about, if you go to like a RevOps user group or a meetup or anything like that, now virtual or Slack group, everyone's talking about like folder conventions and tips and tricks to build landing pages. Like we've gotten too far away from the fundamental concepts of marketing. And so I know there's a big push that like that is its own discipline and profession, but I strongly believe that those individuals have to fundamentally understand marketing to know that they're building the right thing, to know they're building something that matters. It's not just getting that initiative out the door or coming up with this little tip or trick to build a campaign quicker. It's about, are we engaging the buyer? Are we facilitating their journey? Are we serving them as a client? And we can't forget that as marketers. The minute that you put revenue or marketing or sales in front of operations, that means we have to understand that connective tissue between those two disciplines. And I think we're getting away from that. And frankly, if you look at the results of, we bought Marketo, or we bought Eloqua, what is it generating for our business? The results are abysmal. Right? Like there's a Forrester stat out there as of 18, because I don't think they've released the newest version of this report, but I'm looking for it, that 1% of all marketing driven leads are translating into revenue. Like that's terrible, right? And yet we're tooting our own horns and saying like, we've got more technology, we're investing more in operations. This is a great engine. I think COVID-19 is the beginning of that shift to say, yeah, but what is it yielding for us? Like we've got to get back to those fundamentals. We've got to make sure that we are serving the buyer, because without them, we don't have anything here. We don't, people are getting furloughed, businesses are shutting down because they didn't remember who they were meant to serve, even if they were in an operations capacity. So that's where I'm starting to see a lot of that, like orchestration, orchestration platforms and different platforms meant to apply things like AI and data science to actually running those platforms, right? Like making decisions that the marketing ops individual used to make. And I'm afraid that that's going to be the market's response to all of this stuff is not generating a result for us. They're going to start automating it and saying like, hey, a machine can make an equally bad decision as you're making right now. So why don't I do it cheaper?
Right. Well, and so I think those are really interesting perspectives for a couple of reasons. One is we started this talking about the basics. There's a lot of business basics that you get in these silos or these point positions within organizations, specifically in operations. And I think sales operations and marketing operations has evolved technically to the point where understanding business concepts is one thing. It's a totally different understanding how people buy, the emotion behind what you're taking them through, how you're creating something that's compelling. I was having a conversation earlier this morning with a gentleman, and we were talking about technical SEO. And I said, I don't know anything about technical SEO. The way I think about SEO is write something somebody wants to read. And if it's really good, they'll want to share it. That's SEO. But if you talk to somebody that's a technical expert around SEO, like they're like, well, you got to have X number of backlinks, and you got to, your keyword percentage has got to be this. And, and to your point, I think we've lost the humanness inside of this technology where it's actually going to further dilute people's ability to access sales, to access marketing, and to feel like what they're spending money on is yielding results.
That's a great metaphor, because, if you go talk to any digital SEO firm, the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to take the concept of backlinks and traffic, and they're going to try to hack it, right? We're going to put together the 100 best beers in the world, and we're going to put that out through your brand. And we're going to count on the fact that people that are reading that it's placed on a domain with authority, and that people are reading that are going to bounce back to your site. And suddenly they're going to transition their mindset from what are the 100 best beers to should I buy marketing consulting? And that may sound great. That may sound like a great hack to employ, but the fact is the buyer's behavior is not coming in line with that. Like, yes, that's a hack to get traffic to your site, but the result is, Google's smart enough to say like, oh, they're landing on the site and they're bouncing. Like, it doesn't matter the domain authority that has gotten you to that property. If someone's not consuming multiple pages of your content, which means that they were brought there intentionally rather than with kind of this a cloak and dagger approach or smoke and mirrors approach, they're not going to rank the site highly. And I think that's what a lot of firms are built on, which is like, let's take this fundamental hacky concept, and it's going to be really sexy to a marketer because we can show them that this has worked for other brands where they're placing a piece of content that's much more relevant to their brand site, and it worked for them. So how can we hack this together to work for your company? That's going to be our SEO strategy. To your point, it comes down to that it doesn't work like that. Like, the only way that does work is creating really interesting content that drives the behavior that we want to see and ultimately causes that individual to convert. And that takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot, it takes someone that can write from the perspective of the buyer that can serve them in a need, around a need that they want to be served, and prove to them that your brand has the authority and the trust to help them with whatever that problem is. That's a really difficult process to execute against. And most people do not want to take that skills-based approach. They want to take the hack approach to it. And we're getting the results of that.
Well, and it's matriculating into communication. I don't know, when we started off before we started recording here, we were chatting a little bit about email. And one of the things that I thought was most disappointing when COVID hit was email, or marketers. We'll just say marketers. It doesn't even matter what the channel was, but marketers in general all of a sudden leaned into cliches in these challenging times, or in these, I can't remember which, like, I hope you're okay. And everything came across as insincere. It's like everything up to this point has been corporate, and it's been buttoned up, and it's been written in a certain way. And then we tried to put empathy and humanize it, and it came across as patronizing and not authentic. But the channel of email has exploded with people that still 9 months later are leaning into these poor habits and don't really understand their buyers. How do businesses break out of that? How do you, like, when you're talking with folks and you're like, look, the way you're executing, the way you're doing your blocking and tackling isn't working, because when it comes to execution, you're missing the mark. Like, how do you help people see that in their business?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the answer to that question is a really difficult one if you don't already have a relationship with the buyer. When COVID happened, I think there were organizations that had a great relationship with their client. They were able to send an empathetic message that landed, and then someone got a hold of that concept and just scaled the hell out of it. You know what I mean? Like, here's the email that we should be sending, and suddenly everyone was getting essentially the same stock email. That's the problem with marketing, right? Like, we're so hell bent on scale, because someone said, hey, we've got to, these are the economics of a SaaS business. We've got to acquire 100 new logos a month, and it's going to pay off in 7 years, and everyone go do that. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's not based around the specific buyer for that business. You have to know the customer. You have to know how they view you. So, I mean, that's the answer to your question. Like, you have to start there. Do we understand explicitly the people that we're serving? Do we understand how they think about us? Because often it's not how we want them to think about us, right? Like, I was on a call with a large SaaS vendor who will remain nameless, but I'm sure everyone can figure it out, largest CRM company in the world. And the call started off as like, tell me your business goals. And from my perspective, this provider does not influence my business goals. I'm sure they would love to. I'm sure they'd like to have that relationship. I'm sure
Right.
It would be possible to get that relationship, but that's not the state of the union right now. I reach out to these guys when I need a new license. And so that just lands like a ton of bricks, right? Guys, let's fast forward by this. Let me get to why I'm on the call. And that's the state of a lot of provider-buyer relationships these days. You can have an effective communication if you know who that individual is, what they care about, how they view you, and how you're enabling those goals. Until you get to that point, there's no way that you can send out 100,000 email messages and have it land with any degree of predictability. And again, that is the more labor-intensive approach to take. But if we're doing it correctly, if we're every single sales cycle starting out with, what are you trying to accomplish? All right, how can we influence that? How have we done that for other clients? Let's set these benchmarks, and let's consistently revisit our performance towards those benchmarks. And they're not going to be superficial. They're going to be things that actually drive the client's business. Then we start building up that cache of relationships. Then we can pick up the phone when something like COVID happens and say, hey, I know you were trying to do this in Q2. Looks like that's not going to happen. What are you doing? Where are you pivoting? Where can we enable that process? And that conversation can feel genuine. But without that perspective, there's no quick and dirty way to make it happen.
Which I think is interesting, given, like, when I say interesting, it's interesting your perspective of how close you need to remain to your buyer, because I think that might be feeding part of your love for entrepreneurship, right? Because entrepreneurs, when you're starting something from $0 to $10 million, it's a torrid love affair with your customer, right? If this is going to succeed, if this is going to take off, I've got to know my buyer better than better than anybody on the planet so that I can find them, right? Because to your point of, I don't have the funds to do stuff at scale. I can't send 10 million emails out in a day. And, I've got to go be very targeted and very pointed. What's the state? I mean, you started LeadMD on the heels of the recession, or at the beginning of the recession. What's the state of entrepreneurial mindsets and people starting companies? I think I saw a statistic the other day that there's 4x or 5x more companies started in 2020 than there were in the last 3 years. Some crazy number. But
Yeah,
what's
it's
happening
certainly
in
not
the
slowing
market?
down. Well, I mean, there is a backlash coming. I think there are some very critical backlashes coming as well. Like, there's a lot of backlash happening. There's a lot of outrage culture. There's a lot of cancel culture happening these days, and I think some of that's relevant. Some of it is a bit noise. But the backlash against, like, we're going to give you all of this money and you're going to be worth $1 billion in a year. I mean, look at this whole Quibi thing, right? Like, how do you lose that much money in that period of time? Like, it really just, it boggles the mind. And so I don't think you're going to see a lot of, like, that rapid cash infusion, simple, like, we're going to be first to market. Like, not everyone can be first to market. Some people just have to offer a better bread box, right? And the way that you do that is by really understanding your buyer at a core level, and understanding what they're not receiving and how you're going to serve that. And probably most importantly, how you're going to maintain that relationship through scale. So I think that's the question you're going to see a lot of VCs asking, PEs asking, is how do you intend to maintain this proximity as you throw gas on the fire? Because to your point, normally in that first 0 to 10, like, you do have a really explicit relationship with the customer. You are making product decisions based on their needs. You're understanding the value that you're providing, and then something really crazy happens to where we forget all of that and we start hiring 250 people in customer success at one time and giving them really superficial benchmarks so that we feel good about our business performance. But the organizations that keep asking the really tough question and are focused on maintaining that relationship as they grow and scale, again, it's a harder motion to run, but I think that's where you're going to start seeing investors look at businesses differently in that regard. Like, we can't just count on money and fueling that fire and solving everything. Like, we have to make sure that we have those underpinnings that are solid. And so I think you're going to see the metrics in which we measure the health of a business change as a result. And as a result of that, much more cautious money coming into these different organizations from a venture perspective.
Yeah, I think, not that there won't be more unicorns that hit the market from an entrepreneurial standpoint, but I think that the economics behind how you evaluate a $1 billion unicorn are going to dramatically change. One of the things that feels very, very lost, specifically in the SaaS space when it comes to companies that are out there, is the idea of profitability. So many companies are on how much market share can we acquire? And instead of thinking about profitability to fund R&D to develop another, component of your product to serve a different niche, it's just how many people can we get into this generic product and run. And there's some hell to pay for the next round of entrepreneurs. But it's like, what worked for the last 10 years is probably not the way that's going to work in the next 24 to 36 months. The way that VCs and angels and people are looking at moving money I think it's going to be different, or at least more difficult to find stacks of capital to get a Series A or a Series B if you're not thinking about profitability, if you can't show that if you move these elements, that there's the profit and this is how the business operates to generate, long-term sustainable revenue.
Well, a lot of these businesses are just based on an unsustainable customer acquisition model, right? Like, we have to acquire 500 new customers on a monthly basis. All right, well, COVID happens. Can you sustain your business if you don't have this just wildfire acquisition happening? And to your point, like, a business is there to make money, and we move that perspective to what a business could be worth versus what a business is worth right now. Like, the concept of EBITDA is a really solid one, right? And yet we've ignored that with the promise of of health down the road. And COVID's given us a great perspective to say, well, okay, what if everything changed tomorrow? What's your plan then? And a lot of these businesses had no plan. Like, no, we're just going to add more reps. We're going to add more customers, then more reps. And 10 years down the road, we're going to be, a $20 billion organization.
Well, now you
show me the alternative.
Well, right. And so I think there are two things that are happening that are really, really interesting. I think the predictive revenue model, the playbook, the first sales that Salesforce ran to scale up, the playbook that Marketo ran to scale up, right? You've seen company after company after company run this playbook to scale up with we'll just throw either more BDRs or more account reps on it. We will go acquire territory through outbound progressive. Like, it's getting to the point where that particular model is showing its age. The market is saying, I don't really like being engaged like that anymore. As a matter of fact, Mr. Google is now my encyclopedia. So if I want to go look something up, I'm going to go find the information myself.
Right.
And it's a really unique time in that I think, and it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this, but I think we're going to see marketing have to begin thinking more like sales earlier in their content, earlier in the things that they have available for people to come through. Not that you're out there asking for dollars, but that you're getting people to nod their heads yes. You're getting the mini commitments through what people are reading, through what they're consuming as they're going through, because I'm not going to tolerate sitting in a conversation with a software salesperson or a salesperson in general who starts at, hey, I want to know at the very beginning. So in your inception, where did you come from? It's like, I don't care. I have this particular problem, or I've educated myself to this particular situation. If you have to go get this whole backstory, you're wasting my time. I just want to make a yes or no on this particular object. What do you see happening to the sales and marketing teams and their go-to-market strategies? This is shaking everything up from field sales all the way to content plays.
Yeah, those baton passes, the pass from, our typical waterfall, pass from marketing to sales to customer success, those are really ineffective, because the fundamental question that you need to ask at each of those points: what's your problem and how do I solve it? What's your problem? How do I solve it? What's your problem? How do I solve it? People do not have an appetite for answering that 3 times. They don't even really have an appetite for answering it when they feel like they've already answered it via digital behavior or via information that they've provided. What they do have an appetite for is solution, right? How are you enabling me with the solution? Not like, how are you qualifying me so I can hand you to the next person in the line, but how are you willing to invest within solving my problem right up front? And your approach to that problem solve is what will build trust and allow me to actually become a client of yours. So I think value is moving to the front of that chain, which again is something that we've seen successful organizations do through the lens of COVID, which is, let's bring value and solution provision to our client right up front. Let's start talking about like how we can solve that right at our initial interactions. And let's make sure that we steward that really successfully through what we would consider sales, what we consider customer success. The most important aspect there is that the buyer doesn't think in terms of those silos. They don't think in terms of those handoffs or milestones. They just think of, I've told you what I need, and you're going to start solving for that. At some point, I'm probably going to buy something from you if you convince me that you can solve that for me. But I don't like this whole, we're going to have a customer kickoff. From a client perspective, like, I hate that. Like, I've already told you what I need to do. You've already kind of mapped out what you're going to do to help me. Why am I explaining myself to a brand new team? So I think that you're seeing a revenue focus, rather than marketing, rather than sales, rather than customer success. I think you're seeing a unified revenue team that has to serve the client in a very just consistent and comprehensive way across that life cycle. And again, whatever we've centered around as the metric of success, we have to be transparent in how we're providing that solution, how far along that path to solving that or generating that result we've gone, and keep that as our North Star. And until we do that, how we slice marketing or sales, or sales becomes more marketing or marketing becomes more sales, doesn't matter, because from the lens of the buyer, it's all one journey.
Which, the thing that's interesting about that is you're talking about the way that we progress through school, where it's a transition from second grade to third grade to fourth grade, right? Like there's this natural evolution, and my fourth grade teacher never worries about what I learned in first grade. They just assume that I know it, and it continues to progress and move forward.
Sure.
What I hear you kind of summarizing there is that the consultative sale, as it was deemed by large enterprise companies in the mid 2000s, we're going to come along and we'll be a consultative sale, but you still had those components of, oh, we got through the sales process from a consultative standpoint. Here's now your account rep and your customer success person. This person, right. Like you still have those introductions, right? Here's where the bridesmaids and the groomsmen stand in the wedding. We've gotten married, but this is where you're going to stand. I think that the thing that's interesting about that is consulting and consultative selling takes a whole new approach, because it's like, look, I can't just like my relationship can't end when you sign on the dotted line, and right. Somebody's service relationship can't just start. They can't begin understanding your business at the point in which you sign on the dotted line. Like that transition, if there is even one, has to start much earlier, and you're getting more people involved for a true partnership, which should result in a better outcome, right?
Logic would tell me, right? And again, that's a decision that has to be made from the top down within an organization. We are going to serve our client. We're going to understand what they care about, and we're going to make sure that we're holding ourselves to that same standard. And then we talk about how that looks from a process standpoint, and then we start talking about what areas within that can we scale. What can we add automation to? So my point being, we have to take a top-down approach to re-engineering how our businesses serve our client. I think, unfortunately, you're already starting to see, okay, people have grasped onto that trend. They think it's a good idea. And what are they doing? They're starting to sell CDP. So once again, now we're taking a technology approach on something that really needs to be culturally embedded within an organization in order to succeed. And we're buying a tool that says, well, I'm gonna connect all those data points, and that's gonna allow me to serve the client in a holistic manner. But without the other end, without the other spectrum, and those items meeting in the middle, we're not gonna succeed about it. We're not gonna succeed with it. We're again gonna make a ton of investment in very expensive platforms and technology that allows us to communicate based on that data. And then we're gonna wonder why our fundamental result has not changed here. It hasn't changed because we don't have that service mentality. We don't have that value mentality. That has to come from the top. And that's why it's so important that organizations use something like COVID to zoom out and say, where did we fail? How are we going to create one consistent journey? And then we can talk about how we automate and so on. But that hacky approach of like, hey, what can we buy that's going to transform us tomorrow? That goes against the very concept of customer relationship.
And what I like about what you said there, because to me, it's if you zoom out and you look at things at a macro level, and you look at what the challenges are that your company's facing, and you look at ways and where maybe there were missteps, I would be willing to bet that 90% of the time, if you know who your customer is, the reason that you have missteps is because there's a miscommunication. You said tomato, somebody heard tomato, but it really meant potato, right? Like it's, and I had a guest on last season's Mark Skiles, and we talked. He's a fractional chief data officer, and he was working in a very large agricultural company, and they were talking about all of this data that they had, and the concept of a CDP wasn't really the thing for what they were talking about, but the concept is essentially the same, where they were going to try and aggregate all of this data and bring it together. When they started to try and map things, what the research and development was calling this particular field or this particular item meant something totally different to finance, which meant something completely different to the sales team. And marketing was like, what are you guys even talking about? And so there was the need for a dictionary just to actually create common language and saying, oh, these are the definitions. So if you start with the definitions, what does that look like in your data? And so now we know we're talking about the same thing. But that process took them 18 months just to kind of get to the point where it's like, we started the project, got 6 months in, couldn't figure out why it wasn't working, took a step back and went, oh, we need a dictionary. so we can actually talk to one another. And you start to think about that. I mean, to your point of the CDP, if you don't come back to, NLP, neurolinguistic programming or natural programming language, where what you're saying and what it means are the same to both people, you're going to still end up with bad data, bad execution, and a horrible customer experience.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. I think the other ramification of how we've been running this process for over a decade now, that the other ramification it's created is a disdain on the part of the customer. They expect these poor experiences. They expect that a business is not really going to be able to help them with their challenge. That's going to fall in their court. And so we've also created this gap in expectation. So it's not just about solving for that streamlined journey internally, making sure that we have all the supporting data, that we understand, one department understands the next, and so on. It's about creating resetting the expectation that we can help, that our job is to help rather than our job is to monetize. And that's a whole different a set of challenges to overcome. And that's probably the larger challenge as well. Like, you think about how buyers buy right now. Where do they buy? They buy at the end of the month and the end of the quarter. Salesforce taught them to do that because they fundamentally believe that the seller is not out to help them. They're out to retire their quota. And therefore, I'm going to wait until they have the most quota pressure in order to purchase from them. Like, you can find probably dozens of perceptions that we've created in our modern buyer that are similar to that. We have to reset those perceptions and those expectations. And that is another journey that these clients are going to have to, or that companies are going to have to go on, because it's not as simple as solving our process. Now we have to recreate the relationship with the buyer that we bastardized over the last 10 years as we've tried to create these revenue engines that just crank new customers, and we've completely just forgotten the concept of true customer relationship and trust.
And so I can't think of actually a better way to leave this than on those thoughts, because you said it best. Our job is to help, not to just monetize. And when you boil it down to that, right? If you're a company that's out to help, you'll succeed. You may not succeed as fast as some others, but if you're in for the long game, if you're into, always be helping, and you're thinking about your customer, you can't help but win, because if your customer's winning, you're winning. So yeah, I think that's
longevity, right? Like, speed has been what we've been focused on. We have to focus on longevity and the ability to weather these storms.
Again, just tremendous insight. Justin, if somebody wants to find you, follow you, get in contact with LeadMD, where can I get a hold of Justin?
Yeah, so LinkedIn's always a great channel. If you want to email me, I'm jgray, JGRAY @leadmd.com, or hit me up on Twitter. I'm @jgraymatter.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for being on the show. It's been great to have you here.
I am a show now.
And apparently you do this often. So if you were watching OpStars or on OpStars yesterday, and then today we're chatting about really just everything as it relates to the state of business. So I appreciate your insights. We've enjoyed having you on the show.
Kyle, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Summit Podcast. This is your host, Kyle Hamer. Until next week, make sure you like, subscribe, and share. You've been listening to Justin Gray and Kyle Hamer, and we'll talk to you next week.